She was only a maid, the guests said with polite smiles and cruel little eyes, but she was about to be the only person in the room who understood dignity. The chandelier light spilled across the marble floors of the DeLuca estate, turning every glass, every silver tray, every polished surface into something almost unreal, as if the whole house had been built to impress people who had never once had to fight for anything honest. Elena Brooks stood at the edge of that glittering world in a simple navy dress and black shoes that had already carried her through 12-hour shifts, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture calm even while the room around her made it clear she did not belong there. She had come only to work, only to help serve the wedding reception, only to earn her hours and go home to the small apartment she shared with her younger brother on the south side of Chicago, where rent was always due and every dollar had a name attached to it. But this evening, in a room full of wealthy guests pretending kindness was the same thing as character, one small mistake was all it took to turn her into entertainment. A bride's cousin with a perfect smile and a sharper voice looked Elena up and down and laughed softly. "Careful," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "You'll polish the wrong table and ruin the entire evening." A few people chuckled. Someone else glanced away and said nothing. Elena lowered her eyes for half a second, then lifted them again, because she had learned long ago that some people mistake silence for weakness when it is really just restraint. She reached for the tray of empty glasses without a word, but another guest stepped into her path and made a show of checking the label on her name tag, as if reading her name from a distance gave him permission to judge her life. "Elena," he repeated, drawing it out with a smirk. "That sounds like a name you'd hear from the service entrance." More laughter, softer this time, the kind people use when they want cruelty to sound like a joke. Elena's cheeks warmed, but she did not flinch. She had spent years learning how to keep her face steady when the world tried to make her feel smaller. Her mother used to tell her, before the hospital bills and the long nights and the silence that followed, that a person's worth was never measured by the kind of floor beneath their feet. Elena had held on to those words like a prayer. She had polished offices, wiped down hospital rooms, and skipped lunches so her brother could have dinner. She had worked under fluorescent lights, in rainstorms, in holiday rushes, and through winters so cold her fingers cracked. She knew what labor looked like. She knew what sacrifice sounded like. And tonight, while the guests in silk and diamonds drifted past her as if she were part of the furniture, she had no idea that someone at the far end of the ballroom had been watching her every move. Marcus DeLuca stood near the windows, one hand in his pocket, the other resting loosely against a crystal glass he had not touched. He had the stillness of a man who was used to rooms quieting when he entered, a man whose name changed the temperature in every conversation. The family called him the head of the business, the uncle, the patron, the one who handled matters no one else wanted to discuss. But behind the tailored suit and the controlled expression was a man with a memory sharpened by loss. And when he saw Elena lower her head instead of answering their mockery with anger, something in him shifted in a way he did not yet understand. He noticed the way she kept her hand steady. He noticed the way she did not beg for approval. He noticed, too, the small silver cross resting at her throat, catching the light whenever she moved. And while the room continued to hum with music, perfume, and shallow laughter, Marcus DeLuca found himself listening to the one person in the ballroom no one else seemed to hear. Her dignity was quiet, but it was unmistakable. Before the music could settle again, Elena felt the familiar heat rising in her face, the kind that came from being watched by people who had already decided she did not belong in their world. She kept her eyes lowered, not because she was ashamed, but because she had learned long ago that dignity sometimes survived best in silence. At the edge of the ballroom, the laughter around her grew thinner, sharper, and more deliberate, like glass being tapped with a ring. One of the younger women near the dessert table tilted her head and smiled the kind of smile that was meant to wound without ever sounding rude. "I still do not understand why people like that are invited," she murmured, just loud enough to be heard by the nearest guests. Another voice followed, smooth and pleased with itself. "It is probably because wealthy families enjoy charity more when it is dressed in formal wear." A few people chuckled into their champagne glasses, and Elena felt every laugh land like a small insult. She had carried trays through houses far grander than this one. She had scrubbed floors that shined brighter than the heels those women wore. She had worked through long mornings with aching shoulders and skipped lunches to make sure her little brother had medicine, bills paid, and a future that did not collapse under the weight of other people's contempt. None of that mattered here, of course. Here, they saw only the uniform. They saw the posture. They saw the quiet black woman standing near the wall and decided that was enough to define her. Marcus did not move, but his attention sharpened. He watched the way Elena drew in a slow breath and held it, the way her fingers curled once around the edge of the serving tray before relaxing again. No protest, no apology, not even a glance toward the women who were insulting her. That, more than anything, seemed to disturb him. The room expected tears, perhaps, or a trembling voice, or the awkward defense of someone trying too hard to prove she belonged. Instead, Elena stood with the calm of a person who had already survived worse rooms than this one. The pianist at the far end of the hall changed songs, the notes softening the tension for everyone but her. Marcus finally set down his glass. The movement was small, but it changed something in the air. A few guests noticed. The men nearest him straightened almost without thinking. He stepped away from the wall and crossed the polished floor at an unhurried pace, his shoes making little sound against the marble. When he stopped beside Elena, the laughter around them died in fits and starts, as if the room itself had suddenly remembered who he was. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, his voice even in calm. "Come with me." She looked up at him, startled by the gentleness more than the command. His expression gave nothing away, yet the concern in his eyes was unmistakable. "Sir?" she asked, careful and soft. Marcus glanced once toward the guests who had been whispering behind their champagne flutes, then back to Elena. "You should not have to stand here and absorb that kind of disrespect." The nearest table fell completely silent. A man in a navy suit shifted in his chair and looked away. The women who had been smiling moments earlier suddenly found their glasses very interesting. Elena lowered her gaze again, not trusting her voice yet, because kindness from powerful people was often temporary, and she had lived long enough to know that mercy could vanish as quickly as it appeared. But Marcus was not looking at her the way the others did. He was looking at her as if he had noticed something essential. "There is a quiet room off the east hallway," he said. "You can wait there until the speeches begin." It sounded simple, almost ordinary, but the offer landed like a hand reaching across a widening gap. Elena hesitated. She had spent too many years being told to stay where she was put, to be grateful for less than respect, to smile through humiliation because that was easier for everyone else. Yet something in Marcus's posture made it clear that this was not pity. It was choice. He was choosing, in front of everyone, to treat her as if her comfort mattered. That alone was enough to unsettle the room. One of the guests gave a faint laugh, hoping to turn the moment back into something harmless, but no one joined in. The silence was too complete now, too heavy with judgment and curiosity. Elena finally nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but steady. Marcus inclined his head, and for the first time that evening, the guests did not see a boss or a patron or a man built from privilege and power. They saw a line being drawn, clean and unmistakable, between cruelty and decency. And as Elena walked beside him toward the east hallway, every step measured and graceful despite the eyes following her, Marcus felt that strange pull again, the one that had no place in a room like this. He had expected boredom from the evening, maybe obligation, maybe politics. Instead, he had found a woman whose quiet strength was forcing everyone else to reveal exactly who they were. The ballroom stayed still behind them, and for a long moment, no one dared speak. Marcus did not hurry Elena. He walked beside her at a measured pace, one hand resting lightly behind his back, his expression unreadable to everyone watching from the ballroom. The east hallway was quieter, the air cooler, carrying only the soft scent of polished wood and distant flowers. Elena could feel the change immediately. The pressure of so many eyes faded. Though she still sensed the weight of the evening behind her like a shadow she could not quite step out of. Marcus stopped near a tall window where the moonlight touched the marble floor in pale, silver lines. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her the way powerful men rarely looked at anyone beneath their level, not with judgment, but with attention. "You handled that well," he said at last. Elena kept her hands folded in front of her apron. "I did not want to cause trouble." "You did not cause it," Marcus replied. His voice was calm, but there was a sharper edge underneath it now, the kind that came when a man had already decided something and no longer saw room for argument. They did. Elena lowered her gaze, and in the quiet that followed, the sound of the ballroom music seemed far away, softened by walls thick enough to keep the world honest for a few seconds longer. She had spent years learning how to make herself smaller in rooms like this, how to move without drawing notice, how to absorb insult without letting it become part of her. Yet standing there in the moonlit hallway, she realized that Marcus was looking at her as if she had not bent at all. That unsettled her more than the guests had. "You should go back inside," she said carefully. "People will talk if I am gone too long. Let them talk." He said it without hesitation, and there was something almost startling about the ease of it. Elena finally looked up. His tie was slightly loosened now, his face no less composed, but the hardness in him had shifted into something quieter, more focused. "You should not concern yourself with what those people think," he added. "They spend their lives admiring themselves. It is a poor way to learn anything useful." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth soften. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough to surprise her. Marcus noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes stayed on her for one extra beat, as if he had filed away that tiny change in her face with the same care he might reserve for an important detail in a contract or a negotiation. "You are not from this world," he said. It was not a question. Elena's fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. "No," she said, "but I know how to work in it." "That is not the same thing." "It has to be." The answer came before she could stop it. Marcus tilted his head, as if he had expected defiance from the beginning and found it more interesting than obedience. Somewhere in the distance, a glass clinked, followed by the murmur of a nearby conversation, but in the hallway the air had gone still again. "Tell me something," he said. "Why were they mocking you?" Elena took a slow breath. She could have given him the simple answer, the safe answer. Because she was the maid. Because people liked to feel larger when they could make someone else smaller. Because kindness was often reserved for people with the right shoes and the right surname. Instead, she chose the truth that sat closest to her chest. "Because they could," she said quietly. Marcus said nothing immediately. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, and for one brief second the controlled man beside her looked less like a host and more like someone remembering a debt he had never paid. "And you let them?" he asked, not unkindly, but with a seriousness that made the question heavier than it sounded. Elena met his eyes now, fully this time. "I let them think I had no choice." A silence settled between them, not awkward, but charged, as if something invisible had stepped into the room and refused to leave. Marcus studied her for another long moment. Then he turned slightly toward the ballroom, where the chandeliers glowed behind the tall doors like a second, more dangerous sun. "That," he said, "was a mistake on their part." Elena did not answer. She was not sure what to say to a man who sounded less amused and more convinced with every passing second. Somewhere behind the closed doors, the party continued, elegant and oblivious. But here in the hallway, with the moon on the floor and the silence between them deepening by the second, Elena felt it begin. Not safety exactly. Not yet. But the first fragile shape of being seen. And Marcus, for reasons he did not fully understand, found himself unwilling to let that moment disappear. By the time Elena and Marcus returned to the ballroom, the music had softened into something distant and elegant, like it belonged to another world entirely. The lights still shimmered over crystal glasses and polished marble, but the room felt changed now, as if everyone had sensed the brief absence at the east hallway and understood, without being told, that something important had shifted. Elena stepped back and beside the wall, her hands folded so neatly that no one could have guessed how hard her heart was beating. Marcus remained near her, not touching, not crowding, but close enough that she could feel his quiet attention like warmth through the air. Across the room, several guests glanced at her and then quickly looked away, their smiles thinner than before. The woman who had once looked invisible now seemed to carry a kind of unseen weight, and Marcus noticed how carefully she stood, as though she had spent years making herself smaller in rooms that never deserved her. He had known polished people, cunning people, dangerous people, but there was something different about Elena. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to endure, and somehow that made her harder to ignore than all the glittering voices around her. A server passed with a tray of champagne, and Elena politely shook her head when it came near her. Marcus saw that too. Not because she was refusing luxury, but because she moved through the evening with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned not to ask for things she did not need. It was an old habit, and one he recognized more quickly than he wanted to admit. "You do that often," he said quietly. Elena looked toward him, then toward the crowd, as if measuring whether honesty was safe. "Do what?" "Make yourself easy to overlook." The question landed softly, but it struck deeper than he intended. Elena's expression did not change much, yet something in her eyes tightened. "It is usually simpler that way," she said. Marcus let the answer sit between them. Simpler for whom, he wondered. Certainly not for her. The band shifted into a slower melody, and a few couples moved toward the dance floor with the lazy confidence of people who had never had to worry about being chosen or passed over. Elena watched them only briefly before turning her gaze to the edge of the room, where the table's settings reflected light like small, distant moons. Marcus followed her line of sight and realized she was not admiring the room. She was estimating exits, edges, and distances, the way someone might do when they had spent too many years learning to stay prepared. That understanding settled in him with unexpected force. He had spent most of his life dealing with people who reached too quickly, laughed too loudly, and demanded attention as if the world owed it to them. Elena was the opposite. She carried her strength inward. It did not announce itself. It waited. "Who taught you to look at a room like that?" he asked. Elena's fingers tightened around one another for the briefest moment. "Life," she said. Marcus almost smiled at the answer, but there was nothing amusing in it. The simple word held too much. Not only hardship, but repetition. Not one bad night, but years of them. Not a single insult, but a pattern of being measured, reduced, and spoken over until caution became second nature. He looked at her then with a sharper awareness, as though the shape of her silence was beginning to make sense. "And does life always get what it wants from you?" he asked. For the first time that evening, Elena gave him a look that was not apologetic, not guarded, but clear. Not anymore. The words were quiet, but they changed the air around them. Marcus felt it immediately. There was no bitterness in her voice, no plea for sympathy, no attempt to explain herself into being understood. Just a steady line drawn where none had existed before. Around them, the party continued in its gold and glass splendor, but the distance between Elena and the rest of the room had become something more than social. It was the distance between someone who had been underestimated and someone beginning to realize she no longer had to accept it. Marcus kept his gaze on her, and in that long, measured silence, he understood something he had not expected to learn tonight. Elena did not need saving. What she needed, perhaps even more urgently, was to be taken seriously. And that, he realized, was a far rarer thing. He glanced toward the far side of the ballroom where a cluster of guests had begun speaking in lowered voices, their attention drifting back toward them in careful, curious bursts. The room was watching again, but Elena did not shrink this time. She remained where she was, calm and composed, with the faintest lift of her chin. It was not defiance exactly. It was something more enduring. Marcus noticed it and felt a strange, unwelcome respect settle deeper in his chest. He had met women who wanted his name, his money, his protection, or his influence. Elena wanted none of that. She wanted only to be treated like a person. And in a room like this, that request was somehow the boldest one of all. By the time the guests had settled back into their carefully polished conversations, Elena had already returned to her place near the edge of the ballroom, where the light from the chandeliers softened the lines of her face and made her look even calmer than she felt. She kept her posture straight, her hands folded, her expression quiet, but inside, her thoughts were moving too quickly to catch. She had not expected anyone to notice her, let alone speak to her with patience. In rooms like this, patience was usually reserved for people who mattered on paper. Marcus stood a few feet away, speaking with one of the older trustees, but his attention kept drifting back to her in brief, deliberate glances. He was used to reading a room in seconds, to finding the center of every conversation before anyone else even knew where to look. Yet tonight, the center kept shifting, and it was not because of the guests with their silk ties and expensive watches. It was because of the woman by the wall who seemed to carry her pride so carefully that even silence around her felt meaningful. When the trustee finally moved on, Marcus approached with the same measured calm he had shown in the hallway. You do not have to stand here like you are waiting to be dismissed, he said quietly. Elena looked up at him, surprised by the softness of the remark more than by the remark itself. I am used to it, she answered before she could stop herself. The words came out smooth, but they held years inside them. Marcus did not respond right away. He only looked at her, as if he understood that a sentence like that was never just a sentence. It was a record of a life. Around them, the ballroom continued its elegant performance, glasses touching softly, low laughter floating over the marble floor, but the space between Marcus and Elena felt separate from all of it, almost private. You should not be used to it, he said at last. Elena gave the smallest shrug, a gesture that carried more resignation than surrender. People see what they expect to see. Marcus heard the truth in that without needing her to explain it. He had spent enough time around powerful people to know that most of them did not truly look at others. They scanned, they judged, they sorted. Elena, somehow, had survived in the middle of that kind of world without adopting its cruelty. That alone made her stand out more than any gown or title ever could. A soft voice called Marcus's name from across the room, but he ignored it. He remained where he was, his focus fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her uncertain and, despite herself, a little calmer. What do you expect me to see? He asked. Elena hesitated. No one had asked her a question like that in years. Not honestly. Not as if the answer might matter. She glanced toward the guests, then back to him. That I am doing my job, she said. That I belong where I am told to be. That I do not need anyone to make a scene over me. The last part came out almost gently, as though she were protecting him from embarrassment he had not yet earned. Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. It was not irritation. It was recognition. She was trying, even now, to make the world easier for everyone else. That kind of habit did not come from weakness. It came from endurance. He lowered his voice. And if the world is wrong about you? Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a brief second the ballroom seemed to blur behind the seriousness of her eyes. Then the world is usually very confident, she said, right up until it is forced to think again. Marcus almost smiled at that, but the expression never fully formed. He studied her in the glow of the chandelier light, and for the first time that evening, he saw not an employee, not a woman in the background, and not a problem to be managed. He saw someone with enough inner stillness to withstand being misread by almost everyone in the room. And that realization, more than any business conversation or social obligation, stayed with him. Elena did not ask for attention. She did not ask for special treatment. She only asked, in the quiet way people ask for the most difficult things, to be considered accurately. Marcus let that settle between them, then gave a small nod, as if making a decision he had no intention of announcing. Stay here, he said, not as an order, but as a promise that the space around her would be respected for once. Elena watched him turn away, and though nothing dramatic happened, something important had already begun to change. For the first time that night, she was not simply enduring the room. She was surviving it with her dignity intact. And Marcus, walking back into the glittering noise of the ballroom, carried the unsettling certainty that he had just met a woman the room would never understand, but that he now intended to. Before the evening could settle into its polished rhythm again, Elena remained exactly where Marcus had left her, near the edge of the ballroom where the light was softer and the attention of the room seemed to slide past her instead of landing. Yet she could feel it anyway. Not everyone looked at her with the same kind of curiosity now. A few guests glanced away too quickly. A few pretended not to notice her at all. And a few, Marcus realized from across the room, were watching her with the particular caution people reserve for someone they had already underestimated and were now trying to quietly reassess. He did not say a word to her from across the room. He did not need to. His earlier attention had already changed the temperature of the place. Conversations near the center of the ballroom had resumed, but they were thinner now, less certain, touched by the uncomfortable awareness that something had shifted. Elena kept her hands folded in front of her and let her face remain calm, though inside she could still feel the echo of that brief conversation with Marcus, the strange steadiness in his voice, the way he had spoken to her, as though accuracy mattered more than display. It had been so long since anyone had listened without impatience that she almost did not know what to do with the feeling when it came. She told herself not to expect more than courtesy. Courtesy was already more than she had been given in most rooms like this. But Marcus, standing beneath the chandeliers in his dark tailored suit, was beginning to look less like a man passing through the night and more like someone quietly deciding what kind of room this would become. He noticed the subtle changes first. The women near the orchids no longer laughed quite so carelessly. The men near the terrace spoke in lower voices. Even the staff, moving with trays of sparkling water and champagne, seemed to sense that the evening had acquired a second center of gravity, one that had nothing to do with the donors, the speeches, or the money. It had to do with the woman in the plain dress who had been treated as invisible until Marcus Castellano looked at her and refused to continue the lie. He returned to the small cluster of guests near the auction display only because he had to, but his attention was split. Every few seconds, his eyes went back to Elena. He noticed how she never tried to occupy more space than she was given. He noticed how she stood straight even when ignored. He noticed the quiet discipline of a person who had learned not to beg a room for dignity, because begging was just another way to be disappointed. That knowledge settled somewhere deep in him, heavy and unfamiliar. He had met people who performed humility the way others performed elegance. Elena was not performing anything. She was simply surviving with grace. When one of the board members began talking again about the evening program, Marcus answered automatically, though his mind remained elsewhere. A woman beside him complimented the auction estimates, and he nodded without hearing the details. Somewhere behind him, the band shifted into a softer arrangement, the violins brushing the air like a memory. At the far side of the room, Elena lifted a glass of water that she had barely touched, then set it down again as if she had remembered not to make herself too comfortable. Marcus saw that too. He saw the reflex of restraint. He saw how often she seemed ready to step aside before anyone could ask her to. That was the thing that stayed with him most. Not her silence, but the way her silence had been shaped by necessity rather than choice. He had spent years around people who filled every pause with their own importance. Elena moved through silence as if she had learned how to make room inside it. By the time the next round of greetings began, Marcus had already made a private decision of his own. He would not let the night end with her being forgotten again. He would not let the room reduce her to a background detail after she had shown more dignity in a few spoken words than many of these guests had shown all evening in a lifetime. So when the conversation near the center loosened, he crossed the ballroom with calm, measured steps, and returned to where she stood. Elena looked up the moment she sensed him near, and for an instant, the guarded expression she wore began to soften. "You are still being careful with every word," he said quietly, not as a criticism, but as recognition. She gave a small, uncertain nod. "Carefulness is easier," she replied, her voice low enough that only he could hear. Marcus looked at her for a long beat. "No," he said gently. "It is safer. Easier is something else." That answer seemed to unsettle her more than she expected, because she glanced away for a moment before meeting his eyes again. He did not push. He only stood there, allowing the silence between them to do what it was beginning to do all on its own. It made space. It made honesty possible. And in that narrow, fragile space, Elena felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not comfort exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The beginning of being treated as though her words carried weight. The beginning of realizing that this man, whose name could quiet a room, was listening as if what she said mattered. Marcus saw the change in her face before she could hide it. He saw the smallest release in her shoulders, the subtle shift from caution to trust, and he knew with unsettling clarity that the evening had stopped being a social obligation the moment he chose to come back to her. It had become something else entirely. And though neither of them said it aloud, both of them understood that nothing about the rest of the night would remain as simple as it had been. By the time the next wave of conversation rolled across the ballroom, Elena had learned exactly how this room worked. It rewarded polished laughter, perfect posture, and the kind of confidence that could hide a lie beneath a silk smile. She had none of those things. What she had was something far rarer here: restraint. She stood near the edge of the marble floor, her hands folded loosely in front of her, her back straight, and her expression calm in the face of being studied like she was a detail no one expected to matter. Across the room, Marcus watched her from the stillness he had made his own. He did not approach too quickly. He did not interrupt the flow of the evening with grand gestures or loud words. Instead, he let the room keep moving around him while he remained anchored on one quiet fact. Elena was not shrinking anymore. Not completely. The first signs of it were small, almost invisible to anyone else. Her shoulders no longer sat quite so high with tension. Her gaze, when it lifted, stayed a little longer before dropping away. Even the way she held her chin had changed, as if some fragile internal line had begun to straighten itself after years of being bent by other people's expectations. Marcus noticed all of it. He noticed more than he should have. He noticed the way one woman near the bar tilted her head and whispered behind her hand, the way one man gave Elena a look that carried lazy judgment, and the way both of them stopped their quiet performance the moment Marcus glanced in their direction. He said nothing. He did not need to. The effect was immediate and almost invisible in the way only true power could be. The room adjusted around him, then around her. Not because Elena had become someone else, but because Marcus had made it impossible to keep pretending she was beneath notice. Elena felt that change even before she understood it. A server passed with a tray of crystal glasses, and no one brushed too close. A guest who had seemed ready to dismiss her instead gave a brief, uncertain nod. Small things. Nearly nothing. And yet to Elena, who had spent so much of her life being measured by what she did not have, those small things landed like proof. She looked down once at her hands, as if to remind herself that she was still standing in the same room, still wearing the same simple dress, still the same woman she had been an hour ago. But something in the air had shifted. It was not approval. It was not surrender. It was the dangerous beginning of possibility. Marcus crossed the room at last when the music changed again, softer now, almost thoughtful. He stopped beside her with the easy control of a man accustomed to being obeyed, yet he offered her none of that authority directly. Instead, he lowered his voice, his attention steady and unhurried. "You are doing well," he said. The words were plain, almost understated, but Elena felt them as if they had been placed carefully in her hands. She turned to him, and for a brief moment the noise of the ballroom seemed to pull back and blur at the edges. "I am still here," she replied. It was not a boast. It was not even really a defense. It was a statement of fact, but there was something in it that made Marcus's expression change. Not much, just enough. As if he had expected fear and instead found courage wearing a quieter face. "Yes," he said after a beat, his eyes resting on hers with a seriousness that made the air between them feel charged and still. "You are." Elena did not know what to do with the warmth that followed. It was not the kind that came from praise, and it was not the kind that came from pity. It was the rarest kind of all. It was the warmth of being recognized without condition. She inhaled slowly, then let the breath leave her in a way that felt almost like release. Around them, the ballroom continued its elegant charade. Glasses clinked. Shoes touched polished stone. Somewhere in the distance, laughter rose and fell like a wave that had nothing to do with them. But inside the small space Marcus had made beside her, Elena felt the first real edge of steadiness. Not happiness. Not yet. But enough. Enough to listen. Enough to stay. Enough to wonder what it would mean if this strange, disciplined man was not merely defending her from the room, but seeing something in her that she had long ago stopped expecting anyone to notice. And Marcus, while he kept his face calm and his posture unbroken, found himself thinking with unsettling clarity that this was not courtesy. It was not interest in the usual sense. It was something far more difficult to name. It was the quiet and irreversible knowledge that once you had seen someone stand alone and refuse to break, you could not easily look away again. Marcus did not move away from Elena when the ballroom began to fill again. If anything, he stayed closer, his presence quiet but unmistakable, like a steady line drawn between her and the room. The guests had already resumed their polished laughter and careful flirting, but the small circle around Elena felt different now, as if the air itself had been told to behave. She noticed it in the way people glanced at her and then looked away, in the way a few voices lowered when they passed, in the way no one dared to speak too casually in his reach. It was not mercy exactly. It was not spectacle either. It was something more unsettling than both, recognition. Elena stood with her hands folded, her expression composed, even as she became painfully aware of how much of the room was still measuring her. Not her dress, not her posture, not her smile, but the invisible weight she carried simply by being herself in a place that had already decided she did not belong. She had spent years learning how to endure that kind of judgment without showing the wound it left behind. Tonight, however, the difference was that Marcus could see it. And because he could see it, he no longer let the room pretend it was not there. Across the ballroom, one of the women who had spoken too sharply earlier offered Elena a thin, uncertain smile, the kind that came too late to be sincere and too early to be useful. Elena returned it with polite reserve, neither inviting nor rejecting, only remaining exactly as she was. That, more than anything, seemed to hold Marcus in place beside her. He had met women who performed themselves for advantage, women who shaped every word to be chosen, softened, and strategic. Elena did none of that. She did not sharpen herself to win the room, and she did not flatten herself to survive it. She simply stood there, contained and unshaken, as though dignity were not something she had borrowed for the evening, but something she had carried through far worse places than this one. Marcus felt that truth settle in him with a weight he could not dismiss. It was one thing to admire strength from a distance. It was another to witness it quietly, without decoration, in a woman who had every reason to be bitter and had chosen instead to remain graceful. He glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where conversations had begun to gather again in their usual elegant orbit. The crystal glasses caught the light. The chandeliers glowed overhead. Everything looked the way a wealthy room was supposed to look. Yet none of it had the power it had held an hour ago. Not after what had been seen. Not after what had been said. Not after Elena had refused to fold. He heard a voice nearby say her name in a tone that suggested curiosity, maybe even caution, and then fall silent when Marcus turned his head just slightly. It was a small movement, but enough. People noticed him in the way they noticed weather changing before a storm, and they adjusted themselves accordingly. Elena saw that too. She did not smile at the display of it. She did not seem impressed. If anything, her expression softened only a fraction, as if she understood that power without gentleness was just another kind of loneliness. That thought, perhaps more than anything else, made Marcus look at her again with new attention. She was not reacting to his status. She was not dazzled by the room's fear of him. She was noticing the person beneath it, if there was one, and evaluating that person with a calmness that bordered on dangerous. It made him feel exposed in a way that no boardroom or backroom deal ever had. One of the older guests drifted too close, stopped, and offered a stiff remark about the weather, as though none of the previous tension had existed. Elena answered politely. Marcus answered once. The exchange ended quickly, but it left behind a silence that felt more honest than the conversation itself. When the guest moved on, Elena let out a breath that was almost invisible, and Marcus noticed the small drop in her shoulders. She had been holding herself together for so long that even relief seemed to come to her cautiously, as if she did not yet trust it. Without thinking too much about it, Marcus shifted his stance so that she no longer stood alone in the open line of sight from half the room. It was not a dramatic gesture. It did not need to be. Elena understood it anyway. Her eyes flicked toward him, then away, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude alone, not suspicion either. Something more fragile than both. He was not asking for anything. She was not offering anything. But both of them knew that the night had moved beyond the point where they could return to their earlier distance. The ballroom still shimmered with its candles and polished surfaces, still breathed with perfume and expensive laughter, but the center of gravity had changed. Elena had become visible in a way she had not chosen, and Marcus had become involved in a way he had not intended. The consequences of that would come later. They always did. For now, there was only the quiet fact of her standing there, composed and unbowed, and him beside her, less detached than he had ever allowed himself to be. And in the silence between one conversation and the next, Marcus understood something he had not yet said aloud. That protecting Elena from being dismissed had only been the beginning, and that the room, for all its wealth and polish, had already lost the right to decide who she was. By the time the last guests had begun to drift toward the terrace doors and the ballroom had softened into pockets of laughter and glass, Elena still stood where Marcus had chosen to stand beside her. The evening had not returned to its old shape. It could not. Too many eyes had already learned her name, or at least the shape of her presence, and too many careful people had understood that she was no longer something the room could overlook without consequence. She kept her posture composed, her chin level, her hands calm at her sides, but inside her, The strain of the night was still moving quietly, like a storm that had not yet decided whether to break or pass. Marcus, for his part, remained with that same unnerving stillness that seemed to alter the air around him. He was not speaking loudly. He was not performing. He was simply there, and for a man like him, that was enough to make people notice. When one of the older board members approached with a smile that was too polished to be sincere, Marcus listened without interrupting, then turned the conversation with a few measured words that made it very clear Elena would be treated as a guest of importance for the remainder of the night. It was said so calmly that no one could accuse him of drama, and yet the effect was immediate. A chair was pulled out for her without being asked. A server appeared with a glass of sparkling water. Another guest who had once dismissed her now offered a compliment that sounded rehearsed but harmless. Elena saw all of it and understood the change for what it was. The room was not becoming kinder. It was becoming careful, and careful people, she knew, were often the ones most afraid of being seen. Marcus glanced toward her once, just once, and in that brief look there was no demand, no pressure, no promise spoken too soon. There was only recognition. He had seen how she carried herself when she was being measured and found wanting, and he had not looked away. He had seen how she answered contempt without surrendering her dignity, and it had changed something in him that could not be easily named. Elena, despite everything, found herself watching the way his expression softened in rare, almost invisible moments, as if the man who commanded entire rooms had made room for something quieter inside himself. The distance between them was still present in the obvious ways, in the money, the power, the lives they came from. But the more dangerous distance had already disappeared. It was the distance that keeps one person from caring whether another person is hurting. That distance was gone now, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. As the final speeches of the evening began, Marcus remained near enough that Elena could feel his steady presence without being crowded by it. He did not rescue her from the room, because the room no longer had that kind of power. Instead, he stood beside her as if to say that she would not have to earn her right to stay. Not tonight. Not in this place. When the host finally called for the last toast, the chandeliers above them threw a soft gold across the polished floor, and the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath for a moment before exhaling into applause. Elena joined in politely, but her eyes moved once more toward Marcus, and in that glance there was a question neither of them had yet spoken. What happened now, when the night that had started as humiliation had become something far more complicated, and what would remain of it once the music stopped? Marcus seemed to understand the question without hearing it. He stepped half a pace closer, not enough to cause a scene, only enough to be certain she would hear him when he spoke. His voice, when it came, was low and even, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a decision made. Tomorrow, he said, there would be people who tried to explain you away. They will fail. Elena did not answer right away. She looked at the people still smiling under the lights, at the faces that had once dismissed her and now avoided meeting her eyes, and then back at him. For the first time that night, the silence between them did not feel uncertain. It felt like the beginning of something chosen. And in that quiet, with the ballroom fading behind the edges of the moment, Elena understood that whatever the world expected from her, Marcus had already decided she would not be standing alone again. The room still glittered, still hummed with expensive certainty, but its certainty no longer belonged to it. Not anymore.